Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senate is in quorum call.
I'd ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to come to the floor tonight once again to talk about this tax bill that's being rushed through the House and Senate. This is the first time in 31 years that a tax bill of this magnitude has been considered. I don't refer to this as tax reform because it's barely reforming anything. But it seems a shame that we didn't follow in the footsteps of what then President Reagan chose to do when he had the opportunity to reform the tax code when he was president. That bill that he worked on, which was every bit as consequential as the one that is in front of us, commanded the vast majority of votes in this chamber, Democrats and Republicans voting together after years of process, years of committee hearings, years of hearings even out in the country, listening to business owners and economists and citizens talk about what they thought our tax code needed to be competitive and to be fair to the American people. And now, 31 years later, I was in college, I'd say, through the chair to the pages when this last bill was passed. 31 years later, we are on the verge of passing a bill in the Senate with not one Democratic vote, not a single one, and without a single hearing in the Senate Finance Committee on which I served. Not a single hearing about the text of this bill. Not a single hearing to tell the American people that on the individual side of this bill, we are borrowing $34 billion from our kids to give a tax cut to the 572,000 taxpayers that are fortunate enough to make more than $1 million a year. 572,000 taxpayers fortunate enough to make $1 million a year. We think it's so essential that each one of them get a $59,000 tax cut that we're willing to borrow that money from our children to do it. We can't think of a better use than that. A better use is not to give a tax cut to the middle class, because we know what those numbers look like in this bill, because there are not 500,000 people that make $50,000 and less, Mr. President, in this economy. There are 90 million people. And those people are not getting $34 billion. Those people are getting $13 billion. And if you do that math, that adds up to about $160 on average per taxpayer making $50,000 or less in the first year. That's the best year. 2019 is the best year. That $160 a taxpayer works out to about $7.50 a paycheck. So we're justifying $34 billion going to 572,000 families because we say at the essence of this is a tax cut for the middle class that's worth $7.50. I think it's disgraceful to call that a middle-class tax cut. What is as disgraceful is the fact that we're blowing a $1.4 trillion hole in our deficit. Now, there are people on the other side, and I grant them this, who say that we will grow out of this, that the tax cut will pay for itself, which is exactly what President Bush said in 2001 when he cut taxes. It's exactly what he said in 2003 when he cut taxes. Remember, Mr. President, when George Bush became president of this country, he inherited a projected surplus of $5.6 trillion. And then he cut taxes and said that would pay for itself in 2001. He cut taxes and said it would pay for itself in 2003. We invaded Afghanistan. We invaded Iraq. Not only did he not ask the American people to pay for those wars, the 2003 tax cut actually came after the invasion of Iraq. Today we have massive readiness problems with our military. Today we confront the potential for conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Today we confront uncertainties in the Middle East and behavior by Russia that we need to worry about. And we're going to go in debt to give the wealthiest people in America a tax cut they're not asking for? I'm more sympathetic on the corporate side. I believe our corporate rate is too high. And if we had worked in a bipartisan way, I think we could have gotten to a deal that 75 or 80 people would have voted for. And that would have been beneficial for two reasons. It would have represented more widely the American people's view of what we ought to do here. I've heard the majority leader out here on the floor talk about partisan efforts like this and how they're doomed to fail because most of the American people won't support them. We can see that in the polling numbers on this bill. But we could have cut a deal that said, let's bring our corporate rate down to 25. And by the way, let's get rid of some of those loopholes. All the stuff we've said over the years about lowering the rate and broadening the base, let's actually do that. That's not what this bill does. This bill cuts the corporate rate to 20% and leaves all the loopholes in place. There's no broadening of the base. So if today the effective rate is actually in the low 20s, even though the published rate is 35%, the effective rate is going to be far below 20% if we don't actually reform the tax code. I think there would have been bipartisan agreement about doing something with the Earned Income Tax Credit or the Child Tax Credit, as my colleague from Florida has tried to do to a degree. I think there would have been bipartisan support for the idea that we ought to do something to repatriate the money that's stuck overseas and invested here in the United States in infrastructure. But there was no effort to make a bipartisan effort here. None. There have certainly been cases when Democrats have been guilty of that. This is a profound case of the Republicans being guilty of that. And the result of that is they have a lousy bill. And it's a bill that speaks to the extreme wing of their party rather than to the middle of America. Because only in that way could you end up with a piece of legislation that the president is describing as a middle-class tax cut that is not one. Nothing about the math in this tax bill suggests that it is. By the way, that $34 billion I talked about does not include the estate tax. When you include the increase of the estates that are not subject to the estate tax in this bill, that adds on average another $10,000. So now you're talking about borrowing $69,000. So we are now borrowing an additional $10,000 from the sons and daughters of police officers, of firefighters, of teachers, in order to finance an estate tax cut that we won't pay for. Pay for it. Don't borrow the money. Mr. President, I got here 9 years ago at the depths of the worst recession since the Great Depression. Our economy had locked up. And because of those two tax cuts under President Bush, and because of those two wars that we didn't have the decency to pay for, and because President Bush passed so-called Medicare Part D, which is a prescription drug program for seniors, which he didn't pay for, and then the supply-side economics they pursued drove our economy into the worst ditch since the Great Depression. The surplus when President Obama showed up was not a surplus. It was a $1.5 trillion deficit. And Mr. President, I was here when we tried to work in a bipartisan way to figure out how to respond to a terrifying circumstance, not for the Senate, but for our country. I had a woman come to a town hall then who told me her plan was to die sooner because overnight she had lost half of her net worth. And she didn't know how to make it through because the stock market had cratered, because her pension was cut in half. We had more than a 10% unemployment rate in the United States of America, and we couldn't get a single person to lift their finger on the other side of the aisle because they said the deficit was too big. They said that the President Obama was pursuing what the pollsters told them was job-killing government spending. That was the word. It wasn't his $1.5 trillion deficit. That's what he inherited. He left with about a $550 billion deficit. It was cut by 2/3. Today, Mr. President, we stand here talking about this absolutely irresponsible tax bill. It's already at $660 billion, $666 billion. And we've got a government where we're collecting 18% of the GDP in revenue. It's actually about 17.9% before this tax cut goes through, and we're spending more than 21%. And our answer is, let's cut some more taxes. So we'll be spending 17 and change. That's a big delta, 17 to 21. That's a conversation we should be having together, not in pieces. So all these people that say to you, don't worry about it, it'll pay for itself. Remember what they said in 01 and 03. They said the same thing. And they're going to show up here after this Christmas season is past us, and they're going to say, that's why we need to cut Medicaid. And that's why we need to cut Medicare. There is no doubt we have to have a conversation about the sustainability of these programs. And there is no doubt that we have to have a discussion about how we're going to get out of the fiscal issues that we confront. And I have no doubt that the moment we face the next crisis we face, whether it's a national security crisis or an economic crisis, we're going to wish we hadn't passed this tax bill. We're going to wish that when this economy was at full employment, when interest rates are what they are, that we had thought about how to come together in a bipartisan way and actually do something responsible for once. There's a mayor in Indiana who sent an op-ed piece into the Washington Post last week that said, let me break this down for you in terms of my local community. The equivalent of what the Republican tax bill is for my community would be that we would go out and borrow $400 million, which is a staggering sum, not billions and billions of dollars, but on the basis of the size of their government, $400 million. 4 or 5 times what our indebtedness is today, he said. And then what I would do is say, we didn't borrow this money to build infrastructure. We didn't borrow this money to make sure we ended poverty in my community or made sure the water was clean. We gave it to the people in the biggest houses, the richest neighborhood in our community, hoping that somehow the benefit would trickle down to everybody else. He said we'd be run out on the rail. And they should be. So, Mr. President, I wanted to come to the floor tonight to say, look, and again, there are some people that say, politicians that say, well, it'll pay for itself. There's no economist who has said that this is not going to create a deficit. And there is probably a consensus around $1.4 trillion. I have seen some math that says $1 trillion, and others that say 2.5. But let's take the 1.4 trillion and just consider as an order of magnitude, if we didn't care about our deficits, which apparently we don't anymore, what else we could spend the money on besides giving this tax cut to the very wealthiest Americans in our country? In the 9 years I have been here, we have gone from no opioid crisis to an opioid crisis that's killing 50,000 Americans. There are communities all over our states, especially in rural parts of this state, where we have no answer. We provided no additional treatment, even though we have an emergency today that we didn't have before. That's not the America I grew up in. That's not the America that our parents and grandparents set up for us. And look at what you could do to create treatment in every United States county for 10 years. That's this $60 billion. That's this little orange part of a $1.4 trillion hole in our deficit. That's one thing you could do. Another thing you could do would be to provide universal pre-K for low-income children for a decade. That might be worth borrowing from the next generation from, because they would actually be getting a benefit. They're not getting any benefit from this $59,000 that we're giving to people that make more than $1 million a year. You could double federal funding for research and development on clean energy for over a decade. You could maintain our technological advantage over China in emerging industries for a decade. That's a huge concern. That would be $50 billion, just this little slice. A foregone priority if we pass this bill. Just like the response to opioids. You could fund a 20-man mission to Mars because of our fecklessness. We can't even put an astronaut into space without putting him on a Russian rocket. That has nothing to do with our lacking the engineering talent. That has nothing to do with our lacking imagination, or for some of us, a sense of mission. It has to do with the fecklessness of this Congress and the inability of it to walk and chew gum at the same time. We could repair all of America's aging dams, which our parents and grandparents were thoughtful enough to build for us, but which we feel like we don't need to maintain for the next generation of Americans. We'd rather give tax cuts to the wealthiest people in America. You could end the backlog of infrastructure repairs at America's airports. End it. 5 years of funding. That's only $100 billion. I say only, that's a huge number, but not compared to $1.4 trillion. You could end the U.S. Air Force pilot shortage. Why do we have a shortage of Air Force pilots? Because this place, for 9 years, has run itself on continuing resolutions. And the military can't plan. So we have airplanes that are being scavenged for parts and cannot fly. And if they can't fly, the pilots can't get the training hours. And if they can't get the training hours, they can't move ahead in their career, and they can't be ready when the battle comes. You could easily pay for that here. You could fund the first 5 years of the Navy's plan to build a 355-ship fleet. Everyone around here walks around saying, we don't have any money, we're broke. It's a matter of choices and priorities, Mr. President. I cannot think of a set of priorities less out of whack with what Republicans think of in Colorado, much less our Democrats and independents. Here's one we really do care about in Colorado. You could pay for, and all across the country, pay for all deferred maintenance at our national parks and other land management agencies. That's this right here, this tiny purple square, $19 billion. And if you look at the bottom right, Mr. President, that includes over a dozen priorities for rural communities who have been kicked around by this Congress and our CRs year after year. Here are just a few of what fits into there. Extend high-speed internet to every rural community in America. That might be a good use of money, a good reason to borrow money to extend high-speed internet to people that don't have it in a world where telling a kid in a rural school they don't have access to high-speed internet is no different than telling them, sorry, you're not getting textbooks, but these other kids do. We could reimburse rural areas with significant public lands for lost tax revenue. The PILT payments, I promised my colleague from Pennsylvania I'm coming to the end. I know he doesn't believe it. These PILT payments are a pain point for my rural counties every year. We go through the same nonsense at the end of the year, every single year, where they say, is it going to be funded in the CR? They're using it to pay for something else. And yet, it would cost a tiny fraction of just the rural priorities part of it. That's $111 billion. For all the rural priorities, eliminating the national backlog for the USDA Rural Water Program. Can you imagine what that would mean to rural America and economic development in rural America? They wouldn't have to wait for somebody in New York to trickle down to them because they'd have an investment in their community that would create jobs, that would allow them to do economic development and keep their children in their communities and their schools open and their banks open. But that's not a priority for the people writing and voting for this bill. President Trump cut essential air service in his budget, zeroed it out. We could fund essential air service for 10 years, providing a critical economic lifeline to small towns across America and in my state. We could fund the United States Forest Service fire suppression for a decade so they don't have to keep cannibalizing other parts of the budget. This year, for the first year, they spent more than half their budget fighting fires, Mr. President, because we don't have the sense to budget them so they can do fire mitigation. Talk about penny wise and pound foolish. In Colorado, we could clean up the Gold King mine spill. We could fund the Arkansas Valley Conduit to provide drinking water to some of the most remote areas in southeastern Colorado, which we've been promised since John F. Kennedy was president of the United States. We could do everything I just mentioned, all of these investments in infrastructure, research, public health, housing, national security, and rural communities for the cost of this tax plan. And this is yet another illustration, Mr. President, of how profoundly Washington's priorities have decoupled from the priorities of the American people. Beyond that, this bill confirms every other suspicion about how Washington operates. President Trump ran for office saying he would drain the swamp. This tax plan is a creature of the swamp. It was jammed through with last-minute changes, scribbled by hand in the dark of the night, 2 a.m. votes. Shameful. 2 a.m. votes on the legislation that no one had a chance to fully understand. Input from lobbyists on K Street, but not a single hearing where the American people could express their view. And given the process, it should surprise no one that the bill has substituted the priorities of the American people with a litany of carve-outs and loopholes that powerful special interests have gotten into this bill. I'm going to skip this part, Mr. President, because I want to yield to my friend from Pennsylvania, but let me just finish by saying that today, incredibly in America, incredibly, the top 10% of earners take home more than half of America's income. We have not seen that since 1928, the year before the Great Depression. And I know the President knows these folks as well as I do. Everybody on this chart's working hard, whether they're the top 10% or the bottom 90%. But this is not the way our economy ought to work. And for almost all of our history, this is not the way it did work. I was a business person before I came to Congress, before I was a school superintendent. I have nothing against anybody who's done well, but it is preposterous to suggest that the real problem in our economy, when we have a record stock market and record income inequality, is that wealthy individuals and businesses don't have enough. My final chart is this chart, Mr. President, which shows median household income since 1980 till now, the cost of housing, the cost of higher ed, the cost of health care. We've done nothing to address or help this. We've turned our back on this. I think we could have written a bill, as I said at the outset, that had a real middle-class tax cut in it. We chose not to do it. Last year, I met a mom in Rifle, Colorado, at an early childhood center. And in the course of our conversation, she said to me, I work so I can have insurance, and every dollar that I make goes to pay for this early childhood center so I can work. That's a story of too many people in my state, and my state has one of the most dynamic economies in the United States of America. And still too many people that I represent who are middle-class families, whose income hasn't really gone up, not over 10 years, but since 1980, but whose cost of housing, cost of health care, cost of higher education, cost of early childhood education has conspired to create for them impossible choices that their parents and grandparents never had to make. Tax reform should have been the opportunity to address that. It should have been a chance to remind that mom in Rifle that our government, or at least someone in our government, understands the struggle she faces and has the capacity and the will to help do something about it. This bill squanders that opportunity. This tax bill squanders it. Worse than that, it reminds Americans of the vast space between their lives and the priorities in Washington. It reminds them of the yawning gap between their voices and the voices of powerful special interests. We should reject this bill, Mr. President. It fails on the merits. We should reject it because the bill makes a mockery of how our government should work. There is still time for us to set aside this legislation and do bipartisan tax reform. I know the other side may believe they have to forge ahead for a political win, but I would ask, at what cost? As with so many actions around here, we put it on the next generation of Americans. We've kicked all the hard choices on them ever since I've been there. We've told them we're going to continue to live in the house of our democratic republic, but they're going to pay the mortgage. We are so fortunate that our parents and grandparents didn't behave the way we do, Mr. President, because they had the decency to look ahead and think of those to come. We've enjoyed years of peace and prosperity in this incredible country. Mr. President, I think tonight and this week, it's worth all of us asking, will our children be able to say the same of us? Mr. President, I thank my friend from Pennsylvania for his indulgence and for the President's, and I yield the floor.